My name is David Griffith. Today, we are fortunate to have three outstanding speakers with us to speak to us about opportunities for exporting research. I am going to turn the honors over to my co-host, Ahmet Kirca from Michigan State University, to do our introductions. Ahmet, take it away. Ahmet, you are muted.
The typical problem in the Zoom world, right? So, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody from wherever you're joining us. Welcome to our webinar. As David mentioned, this webinar is organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M Universities as part of our Research Spotlight series. First, I would like to thank you and our esteemed panelists for agreeing to join us for today's webinar. The topic of today's webinar is opportunities in exporting research. For this webinar, we invited three international marketing scholars who will discuss their research addressing contemporary conceptual and methodological best practices in the field of exporting. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated by the co-host, by us. David Griffith, and I'll be the co-host today. David is the Holly van der Heider Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing, and Associate Director of Research at the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University. I'm Ahmet Kirca. I'm an Associate Professor of International Business and Marketing at Michigan State University Broad College. And I serve as the Director of the International Business Center at MSU, or MSU CIBER. Today, we have three international marketing scholars who have recently published important work on exporting. Our first panelist is Sanna Katriina Asikainen. She's an Associate Professor in Marketing at Aalto University School of Business in Finland. Sanna's research and teaching covers topics related to strategic management, international marketing, and international entrepreneurship with a focus on exporting. She has published in scholarly journals like Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, JBR, IMR, Journal of World Business, Industrial Marketing Management, among others. Dr. Carlos Sousa is full professor of marketing and business strategy at Molde University College, and he received his PhD from the University of College Dublin, Ireland. Carlos has published over 60 articles in various journals, including Research Policy, British Journal of Management, Journal of International Marketing, Journal of World Business, among others. In 2021, last year, Carlos was awarded the Hans Torelli Award by the American Marketing Association. Dr. Brian Chabowski is Professor of Marketing in the College of Business at the University of Tulsa. He received his PhD from Michigan State University. Brian has published in the field of marketing management, entrepreneurship, and international business. His work was published in various journals, including Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, Journal of International Marketing, International Business Review, among others. After this introduction, I would like to turn the microphone over to David, and he'll talk a little bit about the chat function and how we're going to monitor your questions and about the basics of the webinar. All right, enjoy.
Excellent. So anyone who has any questions, please just use the chat function, or you could directly go to the host. If you want to go directly to me, that's fine as well. And then I will pose any questions in a Q&A at the end of the seminar. So we actually are going to start with Carlos based upon our ordering. So at this point, I'd like to turn the podium over to Carlos. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ahmet and David, for organizing these webinars and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss these issues in the company of Sanna and Brian. Let me start then. I prepared some slides, so let me start sharing my screen. So Chris, can you see the slides now?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I prepared a few slides. So what I did actually, I have two slides really focusing on what I believe would be areas with high potential impact. So that's what I called it. That I think is actually what we have also in the poster to introduce this seminar, where we talk about areas with potential impact. So I'm really focusing here on some areas that I think could be interesting to explore in future studies. The first one that I think would be interesting to explore in more detail, and again, link it obviously to export, which I think there's still not much done, is, for instance, environmental sustainability. I think we are all talking about environmental sustainability now for obvious reasons. I think there's not much yet linking it to export. And when we talk about environmental sustainability, I think we can look at from the demand side, but also from the supply side of environmental sustainability. So, the idea that obviously, from one hand, we have the pressures from the end consumers, and the other, we have it from the suppliers. And suppliers and then consumers, they could have different priorities. So I think it would be quite interesting to explore this topic a bit further. Another one, and it's linked also to the first one, is actually the innovation. So lately I have been focusing on innovation and trying to bring it more into the international marketing and international business field. So there has been obviously quite a bit that has been done on it, linking innovation to IB or to international marketing. But I think, again, there's quite a lot that can be explored further. A recent paper that I published was 2 years ago in Journal of International Marketing. In that case, for instance, what we looked at, for instance, the short-term and the long-term impact of innovation. I think it's interesting in that case, we explored the idea, and we showed that, for instance, exploitative and explorative innovation have different types of impacts over time. So I think that could be interesting to explore in other studies as well. And actually, this study, we linked it to export sales. But again, I think that would be much more interesting to explore this further, because actually, when we talk very often about innovation, and if we divide it into exploitative and explorative, we very much don't take into account the time dimension. In innovation, actually, another thing that I think would be interesting would be even to link it, and again, I said it links to the first topic about environmental sustainability, would be to explore further concepts like eco-innovation. So eco-innovation is, it's a quite interesting concept. For instance, the European Union, the Commission, considers to be very important, and they even developed a plan, an action plan. They call it, I think, the Eco-Innovation Action Plan. So the idea that companies should innovate and come up and produce new products or processes that don't have a detrimental effect in terms of the environment. So I think that would be interesting to link to look at more detailed concepts like this, and linking to export activities of companies. Another concept is strategic agility. So strategic agility has been used, as we know, in the strategic management literature now a number of years ago. More recently, I think an interesting concept would be international marketing agility. Actually, there was a special issue 2 years ago, well, 2019, 3 years ago now, I was a guest editor in International Marketing Review that actually looked at that concept of international marketing agility. So I think there's definitely scope to explore this further, considering the current international environment, and how firms respond to these external shocks, being it the war, being it COVID-19, we very much, you start seeing now more recently, number of articles coming out, to explore how firms dealt with the COVID pandemic. So I think it would be interesting to, to look at these specific concepts of international marketing agility and how, the importance of it for firms in order to deal with these type of external shocks. I have 3 more areas that I think could be also quite interesting to explore in future export research. One would be actually to look into much more detail into corporate social responsibility. This can be linked to different aspects. I mentioned there climate change concerns, the idea, for instance, again, to develop, for instance, sustainable products. Can be linked to geopolitical tensions that we are seeing currently with, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, where, for instance, you see that firms are, for instance, are stopped doing business, for instance, with Russia because of what's happening with the conflict in Ukraine. So I think that would be actually interesting to look at it. And here we can think about things like stakeholder activisms, where actually the stakeholders are putting pressure on the firms to change their strategies. In this case, for instance, exiting specific markets, like in this case, Russia, for instance. You have social movements that are going on. Again, that I think would be interesting to explore this further in terms of how this can change, the international operations of the firms. Actually, there are many examples, but since I'm in Norway, I can mention, for instance, two examples. One is, for instance, the Norwegian oil fund, which is the largest in the world, that decided in March, I think, or in February. I think it was actually immediately in February when the conflict started, when they decided to stop the investments in Russia. And another one is another company, Equinor. Equinor is the Norwegian energy company. Formerly, it was known as Statoil. They changed the name a few years ago. Equinor sounds probably better than Statoil, I think, in terms of, again, the movement away from oil, considering oil as to be now have a negative connotation. So again, you have here example of firms changing their, their international strategies. Could it be from, in this case, from, stakeholders putting pressure on them, or even social movements? One thing that has actually not been explored much is actually the greenwashing. I think that would be actually quite interesting. I have not seen much, the idea of companies coming up, giving false impression that they are doing something in order to protect the environment, when in reality they are not doing it. So I think that would be actually quite an interesting topic to explore a bit further as well. We do see these things, for instance, emerging companies entering more developed nations or exporting to more developed nations. There could be an argument that consumers in these more developed nations pay more attention, for instance, to the environment, or take into account environmental considerations, to a higher degree. And so, it would be actually too interesting to see, if greenwashing actually could play there a role. Corporate governance, I think, would be another area that I think has a significant potential. Here we could talk about corporate values, but also individual values. I did something in the past about individual values. not much done. It's very difficult to collect data about individual values from the decision makers. The idea, obviously, that the values, has an impact in terms of our behaviors, and hence it will have an impact in terms of the strategies that the firms follow. You start seeing something in terms of political connections, particularly from, studies with data from, for instance, from China. Ownership, I think there's still something that can be explored further. The foreign private state-owned companies. Board interlocks is something that I have here as well, that I think could be, that you don't see much about it, particularly linking even to in IB, and specifically linking it to export research. I think that could be an area that could be explored a bit further. So the idea that someone is sitting in the board of a company and is sitting also in the board of other companies, and how this may influence the strategies that the companies follow. Finally, export. The idea of exploring further this idea about sporadic versus continuous process in terms of exporting. So there was a paper a number of years ago, 2016, 17 in GIBS, Bernini et al., that looked into this. I think, again, not much has been done here to explore further the idea about export exit, for instance, and export re-entry. So again, I think these would be areas that I would see in the future, the future studies could explore in more detail. Finally, I just have a few slides, in terms of typical problems that I face, and when I review papers as well, being as a reviewer or as an associate editor, that I see, some problems with some papers that they face, and that obviously creates difficulties for them, for these papers to get accepted ultimately. Constructs. We know that constructs are the building blocks of theories, about being quite ambiguous or undeveloped definitions. The theory, unexplained theoretical linkages, the idea of presenting a model that lacks some type of theory that supports it, one or two. I mean, normally you have one theory, two. I think that would be normal to find one or two theories usually to support a model. Sometimes three. I rarely find more than three theories. I think could be quite problematic. Hypothesis, usually the development of hypotheses that are not linked to theory, and using previously reported findings as the sole evidence for the proposed relationships. And really, the last tip that I think we are all familiar with it, but just to emphasize it once more, when I submit the paper to a journal, is obviously to check for related articles. Other articles that have been published in that specific journal on that specific topic, and ideally cite these papers. Even if they are marginally related, trying to incorporate this reference, I think, are important, and ideally you should incorporate them. Actually, I would suggest in the introduction section. And the final tip for me is that the introduction section is, I find it very difficult to write an introduction section, and it's probably, in my view, probably the most important part of when writing an article, in terms of explaining actually, what we are trying to do and how we are contributing to the literature. And that's it. I think I had 10-15 minutes. David, I think I took 14 minutes. So thank you very much.
Excellent, Carlos. Thank you so much. We will move right into Sana. Please feel free to put any questions into the chat. I'm already getting some directed at me, so we'll hold those to the end. Sana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me start by sharing my screen. But before I can do that, yeah, right.
There we go.
So here we go. I hope that it's visible now. So hello everyone, and many thanks Ahmet and David for this wonderful opportunity to discuss about opportunities for exporting research. So my goal today is to motivate exporting scholars to consider some novel forms of contributions by raising hopefully some interesting conceptual and methodological aspects. And the topic that I've chosen for today is multi-level export research or multi-level research in exporting. And let me justify or reason my topic choice a bit before we go further. So actually, in JIBS, there was a great editorial in 2021 by Sami et al., who examined marketing scholars' contributions to IB literature. And what was noteworthy is that they actually focused namely on exporting and market entry. But despite of the important role of marketing in business, their systematic examination of published works in JIBS identified only 11 marketing contributions among the top 100 most frequently cited publications. In addition, there is some data demonstrating that the contribution of ours is not only relatively weak, but it has been declining. So these insights served as a great motivator for me, at least, to explore what might be the new opportunities in our field for us. Well, I'm personally really interested in management problems and managerial issues in international marketing and exporting. And actually, as highlighted by Hit et al. In AMJ, even if most management problems actually involve multi-level phenomena in real life, still researchers in the field are using a single level of analysis. And based on their observations, rather than dealing with the complexities of multi-level systems, scholars are bifurcated into camps of micro and macro experts who rarely engage in debates and collaboration with each other. And yet we know that the micro or macro lens alone likely yields to an incomplete understanding of behaviors occurring at either level. And approaching exporting topics via one lens only may actually mask or hide some relevant insights. There was also another, a bit related trend in empirical published research. So in their article in JIBS, Serra et al. In 2021 reported a clear decline of IB studies based on primary data compared to secondary data. And they also raised the concern relating to persistently low amount of individual level studies. And like Carlos referred earlier, that it's quite tricky to collect such a data at individual level when we are studying exporting firms. But we need to be aware here that this kind of a trend will actually have a negative impact on methodological pluralism, so which again may lead us having only a partial understanding of managerial problems in exporting. Thus, I believe that there might be some unrealized potential in IB or international marketing and in exporting research specifically that could be captured by adopting a multi-level research approach. So the opportunities for multi-level research are many. And since they arise out of the both theoretical or conceptual and methodological considerations, let's consider a bit both aspects today. So the central theme in multi-level thinking is that organizational entities reside in nested arrangements, like seen in this figure. So the firm managers are nested in their strategic business units or departments, which are embedded in their organization, which are embedded in the markets, industries, countries, and so on and so forth. But still, the disciplinary heritages of scholars working in this area has actually reinforced the differences, not unified them. The micro approach is still rooted in psychology and focused on understanding the thoughts and feelings and actions of individuals. And the macro approach is rooted in sociology and economics, and it's focused on understanding organizations and markets. But yet, in order to fully understand and forecast, for example, firms' export performance, both approaches, or should I even say all levels, may be needed. And this need became very clear to me and my colleagues one day when we were pre-testing one of our individual level instruments related to export decision making. It was actually about entry mode choice. And we were asking export directors to answer to a very simple short scenarios concerning market entry, as we were interested in their thought processes and whether they were kind of victims of certain cognitive biases. So these directors were asked to imagine that they were export directors of this given imaginary firm in our scenario, and they were provided some information about the firm and its past entry mode decision. And then we asked them that which entry mode would they choose in the case that was described to them in the scenario. And their choices, they were very clear, and there was nothing new or alarming with the choices per se. But the interesting part was their responses to our follow-up question, the one we originally planned to use only in our pre-test phase. And what we did there, we asked them to provide the reasoning, the thought process behind their choice beyond our beautifully planned lab experiment. And then this all became very interesting. All the directors participating in the pre-test phase had very clear and very strong arguments to support their choices. So let's have a look, what did they say? The first one, well, this was very obvious. In our firm, we always aim at minimizing financial risk, and that's why we would choose sales agents over own sales subsidiary. And the next one had equally strong opinion. In our industry, the key is to maximize the market potential, and that's why in this situation, we would choose sales subsidiary. And if we look at the comment of our third participant, oh, this was an easy decision. In our market, we need to minimize the uncertainty, and thus this chosen entry mode. So for us, this was very important insight. The entry mode decision-making logic and the cognitive biases related to the decision-making we were originally interested in as a kind of a micro or individual level phenomenon, they are actually so embedded in the firm or market or industry levels that they could not be captured using the methodology that is the dominant one, studying cognitive biases in psychology, for example. And this kind of indicated that we really need to think and approach this issue using multi-level thinking. And thus, I would kind of like to even argue that to fully understand decision-making and strategic choices, we may need to add some firm or market level controls or moderators into our theoretical models, and not only consider them as a kind of controls, but they are actually important constructs that we need to understand. So, multi-level research and the central theme there. So the multi-level research may enhance our current understanding of export performance, for example. And the firm level, the macro level or the meso level approach adopted by the majority of scholars has provided already a good understanding of the links between strategies employed by export firms and their environments and their relationship with export performance. Yet, we still do not fully appreciate the ways in which strategies are actually formulated inside the organizations by managers and how they are implemented. And as noted earlier, we in export research should not forget the individual. For example, the expert manager designing international marketing strategies. The neglect of individual level data leads to an underrepresentation of theories that can contain individual level concepts, and they limit our ability to further develop these salient micro-level mechanisms in IB or IM and in export theories. So neglecting the individual level also effectively reduces possibilities for multi-level theorizing, which we obviously need. And I'd like to refer here to Buckley and Lessard, who have pointed out that the key to international business is that it approaches empirical phenomena at the variety of levels of analysis. Well, luckily, micro-foundation research has already received increased attention in strategy and organization theory over the past decade, and has also been applied in IB and IM. The central impetus of the micro-foundations thinking or research is that or has been to understand how individual level factors impact organizations and how the actions and interactions of individuals lead to an organizational level outcome and performance. Thus, as individual level or micro-foundation research actually features unique set of questions and assumptions, theoretical mechanisms, and independent and dependent variables, it provides great opportunities for novel contributions also in exporting research. By including the individual into our theorizing and modeling, also new methodological strategies may become relevant, like the lab or field experiments in research design, like mixed method approaches, like random coefficient modeling or multi-level structural equation modeling in data analysis. And actually, Aguines et al. Reviewed 43 articles published in JIBS in 2018. And one of the key takeaways from their analysis was that there was an insufficient evidence about causal relations in the published papers, which is also a fact favoring the use of experimental research methods also in exporting. So I did a very quick, very informal review on multi-level research in our leading journal in international marketing, so Journal International Marketing, during the past year, 3 years actually, and it revealed that we have only witnessed, or we are witnessing mainly dual level kind of articles. And by level here, I'm referring to the level of the data. Of course, there are levels of analysis that relates to multi-level research and levels of theory, and they need to be, of course, connected. As there is quite rich kind of literature already on culture and cultural distance and their role and impact in exporting, I actually ignored those papers, but I was more curious to learn what else has been done on this field with multi-level approach. Unfortunately, I did not find much. So I was able to identify 8 multi-level articles. However, only 2 of these studies considered exporting firms, and only 1 had data that originated from 2 different levels. The other one actually had considered data that was on 2 different levels, but it was an aggregate data from one level to another level. So this positive exception was actually the paper by Hofer et al. 2019, studying organizing and implementing export pricing. So I'd like to finish by reminding that adoption of multi-level research approach provides a great venue, not only for experiments, but also for mixed methods research, even for some longitudinal qualitative research for exporting scholars. And we should kind of consider these novel methods as well. And I hope that with this short presentation, I've been able to provide you some new ideas, both for conceptual and methodological opportunities in export research. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Sana. We will now be transitioning to Brian. We have one question that went to everyone in the chat. We will address that question upon the conclusion of Brian's presentation. Brian, podium is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you, Ahmet, for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. And it's a pleasure for me to follow what Carlos and Sana have been talking about today in terms of exporting as well. And I'll put my 2 cents in terms of kind of what I think as well, in terms of what we can do in terms of the exporting literature. So where I thought I would pick up is where my Journal of International Marketing piece that was published in 2018 left off. And it was a bibliometric piece that went through, the data went through 2016. And if you're familiar with it, or if you're not, it uses, in effect, network theory and multidimensional scaling to plot the intellectual structure of the domain of exporting. And so I thought it would be interesting to get an idea of what's been happening since then and try to get some insights in terms of what the data actually show. So what we're using is, like I said, network theory. And in case we know a little bit about network theory, it's about actors that are connected. We have strong ties, we have weak ties, and it's a matter of how much information is communicated between those different actors in the network. And we have opened and closed networks. And one thing that I want us to pay attention to is this concept of network chains here. This is going to be a big issue as a configuration of networks. That's what we see in some of the results that I'm going to be showing us. Now, this is kind of taking the Kuhnian perspective of how the development of future research can turn about or can happen. First of all, we have, say, published articles, which leads to the intellectual structure. And then we have, say, recent research. And both of these sort of influence what could happen in the future. There isn't any crystal ball or anything like that in terms of future research, but typically what the thought process is that future research is based on past and present research, at least to a certain degree. So that's the thought process behind this. So with that in mind, this is what we have as the intellectual structure for the 2017 to 2021 time period for the exporting literature. And you'll notice that we kind of have 3 different what we can call network chains, like I was talking about before. We have groups 3 through 7, which if you look over here, we're talking about, say, internationalization and knowledge topics. If we're looking at groups 8 through 14, then we're looking at sort of the traditional sort of resources, capabilities, and exporting kinds of topics. And this is a very small chain, but this is dealing with, say, internationalization, speed, expansion, born global types of issues as well. And you can see here what the most influential works are down here as well. So the usual suspects, we have Johansson, Valne, Barney, Chavusgil, and Knight, etc. So this leads us to, remember I mentioned network theory before, and this is where it comes in really handy, particularly the concept of weak ties. Now, the concept of weak ties is that you can have some interesting or unique ideas formulate from actors or positions that are far away from each other in a network. So applied to this network in particular, what we can do is we can say take group 3 and contrast it with say group 11 right here, which is, if we look at the map, is pretty much on the other side of the map as a group. And this can lead us to at least one possible type of research question. So we have our group, which is focusing on internationalization and outsidership liabilities, and then capabilities and performance. So our question could be, what types of marketing capabilities can or cannot exporters develop in light of these outsidership capabilities, or I'm sorry, liabilities. The second one, we have group 4 and group 9. Again, here's group 4 and group 9 is here. Okay, so this would lead to how can or cannot exporters develop a market orientation and marketing capabilities in light of those outsidership liabilities. And then using the same process, group 1 and group 9, how can market orientation and capabilities increase internationalization speed? And then group 6 and group 11, what types of marketing capabilities are or are not required for increased rapid internationalization for exporters. Okay, and this is from the original paper, from the 2018 paper, and this is the longitudinal development of the exporting paper. You'll notice here that we have some themes in terms of the traditional exporting topic. We have a little bit of dynamic capabilities, resources and capabilities, knowledge topics, etc. So I thought that it would be good to expand that to the last 5 years that we've had. And this is taken, or these groups are taken from the previous periods, from the articles results. And these are taken from the results for what I have for the presentation. And you'll notice we have sort of internationalization speed here as sort of a sub area. We have the learning, international expansion, internationalization issue there. And we have strategy and export here. And this italicized group here and here, these are new to the longitudinal development. That's why they're italicized. And then we have more dynamic capabilities and resources. And this was the only group here, internal and external export performance antecedents, excuse me, that did not have a continuing research group into this 5-year period that we're looking at. Okay, then the next thing that we can do, remember from that graphic that I showed, we can look at the most highly cited recent articles as well. And we use the most cited per year measure as a metric for that. And it's an interesting way to look at how they actually look in using multidimensional scaling as well. So it's kind of like an intellectual structure of these most highly cited exporting articles as well. And we really have only one chain here, which is groups 2 through 4. And that's going to be focusing particularly on strategy issues and a little bit of capabilities as well. But we can use the same principle here that we talked about before in terms of weak ties, right? So what we can do is we have group 1 and group 6. So again, group 1 and group 6, right? And we can ask our question of what types of digital platform risks result with an exporter's global value chain entry as one possible question. And there's all, like we had before, some other topics that we could consider. Groups 1 and 4 as well. You'll see here, group 1, group 4. How can or cannot discretionary adaptation can be used in an exporter's global value chain entry. Now, discretionary adaptation is different than required adaptation. It's something where managerial choice is involved in terms of adaptation in a particular market. So how much can or cannot be used when or would be used potentially in terms of entering into that value chain. And then for groups 4 and 7, again, discretionary adaptation. How can it be used in terms of exporter co-opetition activity? And then groups 2 and 7, how do marketing capabilities deter or encourage co-opetition activities? And then one more is the research front. Now, the research front is different than the intellectual structure. The intellectual structure and the most recently cited articles is more historically looking, whereas a research front is we're using, as you can see here, we're grouping cited articles by the number of shared references or cited articles. So in effect, what we're doing is we're doing the opposite, and we're more future oriented as opposed to historically oriented. And so we have 1, 2, 3 chains here, groups 1 through 3, where we're talking about, say, emotional intelligence issues, which is going to be interesting. That's why I really like this one in particular. This is a really good set of results that leads to some interesting findings. Group 7 and 8, where we're talking about mainly relational foreign market knowledge, and groups 4 and 5, where we're looking at online retailing. So we have a whole bunch of questions here, or in terms of research, focusing on entrepreneurial internationalization, co-opetition, online retailing, emotional intelligence, and the internationalization process. And this was actually something that I found really interesting, was how does an exporter's emotional intelligence, or the managers in the exporting firm, how does that contribute or not contribute to the internationalization process? And this gets right to kind of what Carlos and Sanna were talking about in terms of looking at the individual manager in an exporting firm. How does something like that impact the internationalization process? I think that would be something really interesting in terms of what what an exporter would do. And then we have, going beyond that, we have emotional intelligence and betrayal and infidelity in international relationships as well. And we can link that with business group experience and internationalization as well. So in conclusion, we've used network analysis to propose some future research opportunities or future research questions by extending the exporting literature through the intellectual structure approach that I've used in the past. The 4 sorts of topics that I've found particularly interesting in this sort of exercise is the discretionary adaptation topic, which is an up and coming topic the way I see it. Co-opetition, activities, mindset, activities more at the firm level, mindset more at the managerial level, emotional intelligence. Again, this is going to be kind of at the managerial level, and then betrayal and infidelity. I think that's something that exporters either need to think about with their partners, or whether they're going to do it themselves. And it can be actually related to the co-opetition activities and mindset too. So thank you for listening and watching and tuning in, and I'd appreciate any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. If people are following the chat, they can see that John put in some wonderful articles on multi-level that people might want to source. Brian, if you could stop sharing your screen, that'd be awesome. And then we're going to go to Q&A. So I've received a number of direct Q&A questions, but also I'd like to address Matt Robson's question right off the bat, and I'm going to pose this to our panelists. So as you see in the chat, Matt says, I would like to see an upward trend in the number of exporting studies. I think we all would. So I think we're all in agreement with that. And he notes it's hugely relevant today for firms and countries with a lot of the things that are going on. And then he poses how can we as a community increase empirical work on exporting per se. So I'd like to pose this to the panelists in a slightly different way, because this pairs with another question that was sent to me. And that question is, do you believe that the shift away from survey research has or will hamper the development of exporting research? So I'd ask each of our panelists, and we'll start with Carlos and then go to Sana and then go to Brian, to describe what you're seeing as an author, as well as a reviewer and editor, and your roles in terms of how exporting research, which has generally been explored using survey research, is being treated within different journals. So Carlos, let's start with you.
I think we have quite a number of journals that welcome, research into export. Obviously, Journal of International Marketing Review, but also in the IB journals, you would find, International Business Review, Management International Review, and so on. JIBS, obviously, you would find that they welcome, papers on exporting. There are some journals that do not, or it's much more difficult, or obvious, since we are, in marketing, for instance. There are some journals where you will find very little, research in terms of exporting or international marketing, generally speaking. I mean, Journal of Marketing Research would be one of them, for instance, an example. It's a great journal, but you would not find much in terms of international marketing and export in a journal like Journal of Marketing Research. I don't talk about others in terms of marketing science, different, but Journal of Marketing Research, which is more broad, I think. But I think that's also to do with how difficult it is to do international marketing research in terms of methodology to get into a journal like Journal of Marketing Research. I think that's an issue that we in international marketing, suffer in terms of, the data that's available, in terms of the reliability, robustness, to get into a journal like Journal of Marketing Research. This is just to give an example. I'm not one to point out Journal of Marketing Research per se, but I just give you an example that, for instance, you would not find in some journals. It's much more difficult to find papers published in that field in some specific journals. I think it's always important to explain the importance of the topic, how relevant it is. It's like when we are doing papers and we are just focused on one industry, we need to explain why that industry is so relevant. If we're focused on the automobile industry, we have to explain how important the automobile industry is in order to get it in. So in terms of export, I think it's not really we need to anymore to explain how export is important, because I think it is acknowledged that that's a very important activity for companies and for the country's economic development. But it's an issue, and I think it's there's some journals and some editors sometimes that it's more difficult to convince them that export research is important and they should publish more about it.
Sana, your thoughts?
Yeah. I totally agree with Carlos that it might depend to some extent also on the journal. So how do they accept or how they approach survey-based research? But I also like in my presentation, I highlighted that also if we kind of move away from survey-based research method that has been the dominant one, we again are suffering from this kind of or limiting the pluralism in methodology-wise if we all call to the secondary data sets. And of course, what has been richness in our field is that the fact that the way how we actually measure our constructs. So we try as carefully as possible actually to measure the kind of concepts of interest instead of using some more or less vague proxies for illustrating things. And I think that's valuable for this kind of how would I call it, allergy to survey research. One solution might be this mixed method studies that I think was covered also in the previous cyber webinar. So there, and especially if we introduce this multi-level research, it might be that for a certain part of your model and theorizing survey is the best one, but then it might be that the other part you might need some other types of data collection. And then of course, then we are adding novelty and complexity also when we are analyzing such a data. So I think that might help us, make us more topical, and perhaps at some day even give us access to JMR or this more methodology oriented journals.
Excellent. Brian? Thank you, Sana. Brian?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of issues that the exporting literature is actually needing to deal with. One is kind of a publicity issue. It has a long history, and some reviewers, some editors think that it's kind of a stale topic. And the real problem is that exporting researchers really need to answer that so what question. You know, how do we refresh, or how do we push forward the exporting research? I mean, what's new? What different ways can we look at it? What can we bring in from other areas that are used in marketing or elsewhere that could apply, that could push the field forward? I think that's one of the issues. And another issue is kind of what Sana was talking about, is related to methods. I mean, you look at top tier journals, you have many studies that are done in one article now. It's not just one or two studies. You have, say, 4 or 5, sometimes 6 studies, and we need to keep up with that. And if we want to have exporting literature published in top tier journals that will be cited, then we need to do stuff like that. We've got to up our game. Otherwise, you know, we're going to be sidelined. It's that simple.
Can I just add one? Can I just add one thing?
Yes, I was going to open it to you and I. Go ahead, Ahmet.
I mean, to follow up on that, I really like to hear what the panelists think about this need to demonstrate the relevance of what we're doing on the export research. Is that a communication problem, or is that a problem related to other issues, such as the marketing world has its own international marketing topics, whereas the IB world has its own international marketing topics, and it's hard to see that, you know, that gap bridged by scholars. I mean, when you see marketing science, I mean, Carlos talked about marketing science, JMR, what counts as international marketing research there is not exactly what counts in JIPS. So export marketing is such a core topic. It's one of the 2 major components of international business. That's international trade, right? So that's where we're coming from as IB scholars. On the other hand, for marketing researchers, export is more like a context. I mean, it's about relationships. It's about testing theories in a particular context. What do you think about those? About that divide? Is there something that we should be doing, or should we just live in our own worlds and be happy with what we're doing?
I mean, we're supposed to be good marketers, right? And if we're good marketers, then that means there are different segments in the market. So that means that maybe there need to be different types of products for different markets. So if you are trying to publish in marketing science or JMR, or even Journal of Marketing for that matter, then you have a specific kind of topic or a specific kind of way that you publish. Whereas if you're going with GIBs, then you take a different technique, a different topic, a different theme, or what have you, so that you have kind of a portfolio theme or themed kind of approach. So you have more impact as a scholar. That's kind of where I would respond, or how I would respond.
Well, I mean, I just suspect that we operate by different values and norms, because the types of theories that sometimes, or types of contributions that you see in those journals from an IB perspective seems to be, well, you know, internationalization is being examined extensively in the IB literature in emerging markets. But you see papers that claim to make that type of contribution, and sometimes it's hard to bridge those gaps. But I understand. I mean, that's certainly a marketing problem. I wonder if what Carlos and Sana think about that issue as well.
I think one aspect, and that was mentioned by Brian, is in terms of marketing, promoting it. But I do think that, you know, while governments and countries understand the importance of exporting, and this discussion actually started with a comment made by Matt, and Matt, you know, being in the UK, knows the importance that, you know, after Brexit, that, for instance, the UK government is putting now on, you know, British firms to, you know, to do trade, to enter foreign markets. I think one key aspect has to do, in order not to get into journals, or you don't see much like in GMR and marketing science, for instance, in terms of export, I think comes back to the methodology, to the methods that we use currently in export research, and you know, and what is required, or what the editors expect in those journals and to get in, and which we are currently not doing in terms of export research. Being it because of it's very difficult to get access to these type of data that they expect us to get. And I think that's actually the main reason, is that it's very difficult, if sometimes not even impossible, to get access to this type of data, to control for certain things that we cannot control for, or it's almost impossible to control for. That is different if you do it in a domestic context.
Sana?
Yeah, let me take a bit different kind of approach. So something that I've been witnessing is that once you try to develop something, make a contribution to a certain, let's say, management theory, and then you conduct your research in exporting, let's call it the context. And if you try to submit that kind of a theory contribution to some leading journals beyond our own scope, they are not very often very open to that kind of a paper, because the context is still beyond their scope, and still, while you are kind of developing these cross-disciplinary papers, you, or at least I, very often cite a lot of IB journals, and perhaps the kind of the way of thinking is also IB related. So I think that there has been also issues of because we kind of how would I say, deviate from the convention in their field, and that's what happens. And then we end up in publishing in our own kind of circles, using language that is more common, and positioning our papers in more traditional ways. And I think that's also partially limiting our kind of a contribution in management journals, and sometimes in IB journals as well. But that's just my opinion.
Oh, that's excellent. And I'm gonna pose a question, not necessarily to the panel, but to the panel and to actually the audience, because Matt, John, Peter are all here with us, and I have my own hypothesis why we're seeing less exporting research. Over my 6 years as editor of JIM, and then serving for a decade on the GIBERs editorial board, I'm actually seeing less exporting research submitted and a larger amount of consumer behavior research submitted. And I think that that has been a substantive shift from sort of the management strategy, exporting literature, to just the field shifting. So I know we can't open mics, but if anyone sort of who is seeing manuscripts come through the process would like to go in the chat, that would be awesome to sort of see from, John's perspective, or Peter or Matt's or anyone else's who'd like to comment, who are seeing manuscripts come through. I'm just not seeing as many exporting papers, and I think we should. And that's why Ahmet and I really want to have this, because there's such tremendous opportunities. I am going to shift to a sort of individual questions that have come through to me. So I'll start with Carlos. Carlos, the question is, can you speak more about some of the potential topics within corporate social responsibility and exporting that you see as sort of great opportunities for over the next 5 to 10 years? So I think they're looking for a little more sort of ideas generation, if you will.
Okay, so so in terms of what I talked about corporate social responsibility, I mentioned a few issues. I mentioned the part about linking it to the environmental, to the climate change and concerns. I mentioned it, the geopolitical tensions, the stakeholder activism, social movements, and greenwashing. These were the issues that I mentioned broadly. I do think there's quite significant scope there to explore this further, because I have not seen this much in terms of export. So all of these, actually, if you think about this, link to what's actually happening now. So the idea of corporate social responsibility, we talk quite a lot in terms of, nowadays companies need to be more responsible, being it linking to the environment, or being it linking to, for instance, what's happening now currently, for instance, in Ukraine. And I gave you the example of actually two Norwegian, well, one's the Norwegian Wealth Fund and the other one is the Norwegian company, but I can talk about, other companies as well that we are familiar with. So I think it would be interesting to explore actually how these aspects will have an impact in terms of the company's export activities, because we do see it. It's not that the companies actually want to stop, for instance, if they actually just look at it from a profit orientation. I want to make money. It makes sense that they would, for instance, continue doing business with certain countries. However, there's lots of activism, lots of pressure for them to stop doing it. So it would be interesting to see this actually, this duality that exists between a company that wants to continue to make money and a company that needs to be responsible. So the idea in the past that the ultimate goal of a company is to be profitable, for instance, compare this with now actually maybe the goal of a company is not just that. More important than that is actually to appear to be responsible. And this can actually then also link actually to greenwashing. Companies that actually use strategies to appear that they are responsible, but in reality, in this case, concerned with the environment, but in reality, they are not. And I think linking this with, and you do see companies sometimes entering certain types of markets where these aspects are more important than others, like being concerned with the environment. And would be interesting to see if companies, for instance, are using strategies, to, for instance, to create an image that is, for instance, not correct, and thereby, influencing the perception that their end consumers may have or not. So I think it would be interesting to see this. Actually, linked to this, we can also think about, we always think about companies, what companies starting now doing, not starting doing, but would be interesting, is like companies actually following what these activists are doing all those covert operations to actually thinking about what these activists could be doing to them, and taking preemptive strikes, if you want to call it, decisions in order to deal with that. I think that issue has not been explored much in detail generally, and definitely not in terms of export.
Next question is for Sana. is the literature becoming more accepting of a qualitative approach so that researchers can gain a deeper understanding of the micro level strategic decision-making in exporting, do you think?
Okay, that's a good question. I must confess that my orientation is more on quant research, so that's what I'm reviewing and that's what I'm conducting. But I believe that for these multi-level issues, like I said, that there are opportunities also for qualitative research. And I think I came across with one longitudinal case study already that was actually exporting issues on multi-level. So taking the challenges we have in collecting such data for export studies, I think there might be opportunities, bigger opportunities for qualitative research in exporting that we have by so far seen. But of course, this question should also be directed to some journal editors. How do they see, how would they like to publish qualitative studies in exporting in their journal?
Oh, that's an excellent point. We will pose that to our panelists who are chiming in on my other one. Matt, Peter, and John are as well. So that's wonderful. Everyone, please follow the chat so I'm not repeating all of those. Brian, I'd like to direct this next one to you, which is in your analysis approach, do you capture country issues? I think what they're talking about is there a breadth of research on certain country markets and a need for research on others, or is that not, is that context not captured within the analysis?
It's captured in the analysis, but what we're looking at are the top 25 or so most influential works in the domain at any particular time or with any particular scope. So those types of works did not really show up as most influential. So that's why they didn't appear.
Excellent, excellent. This one goes back to Sana. Sana, can you speak a little bit to the process and cost of a multi-method approach being conducted within an exporting context?
Yes, let me start with the costs, because it is obviously an issue, and that might explain why we see such a kind of a big increase in consumer research. And I think John was adding there in the chat that there is a lot of consumer research, these experiments done at consumer level. So they are relatively easy to do as long as journals are accepting data from MTurk and others. But it's much more tricky to conduct experiments with export managers and directors. And of course, when you start adding multiple data that is not from MTurk, the costs are increasing tremendously. So definitely this is an issue. But on the other hand, this kind of I would say communal act is an opportunity for us. So I'm referring to entrepreneurship in 21st century research that John is hosting at Loughborough University. And that group has been able to collect tremendous data sets from multiple countries without having formal funding. So I think we need to network in order to kind of find ways to cover the costs raising from the data. And of course, this kind of international network of scholars is needed if we want to go and theorize on also on the country level, because then 2 data points from 2 different countries is obviously not enough for us, and this makes it even more difficult. So even if there exists beautiful methodologies like HLM, they are really difficult for us to apply if we go all the levels up. So process-wise, personally, I would start from theorizing. So thinking what are the kind of the interesting theories and theoretical opportunities, and then go down to see what is the level of data that is needed and what is the level of analysis and whether it's doable. So that would be my way to go.
Excellent. And John's saying he loves qualitative research and he loves networking. And I think we all do need that beer, John. So I think we're all good with that. Now I've lost the question. Hold on. I just had the question. Shoot. Hold on. I've just lost it. I lost the window. Give me 1 second. This goes to Brian. Brian, how do you come up with your research questions?
Usually I look for something that's interesting to me. That's how I come up with my research questions. It's as simple as that. Sometimes I find something that's actually interesting in the results, and sometimes I don't. But this was really an easy, a really easy task, because I had already done an article on this, and David and Ahmet had asked me to present something on the topic. So I was really interested, to be honest, to see where we are and how particularly the future research ideas, which I think is the bread and butter of these types of studies, whether it's a framework, a future research framework, or whether it's a weak ties analysis like we did here. That's really the interesting part. That's what I really love about doing these types of things. So yeah, I just look for things that are interesting to me, particularly in international marketing.
Excellent. So this next one is going to be for all three of you, and we'll start with Carlos on this. There has been greater concern within the academy pertaining to questionable research practices, things such as moving towards pre-registration, having third-party audits of survey data, publishing data, etc. In the area of exporting, could you speak to one or two aspects of maybe transparency or research process that scholars should engage in to ensure validity of the results, at least within the context of their study?
That's a difficult question, actually. The problem, I mean, in terms of the data, if we have survey data, you know, it could be asked, and you start seeing this where you make the data available for you know, for the reviewers to check it, and some journals are asking for this now. So that's definitely a step forward to make the data available for the reviewers to check, and even, you know, available as well, even in the future, maybe for, you know, other researchers, makes actually publicly available. It's sometimes difficult to make it available. You don't want to make your data available as well. You know, it's your data, and there could be some confidentiality issues that you don't want to make the data available. Lately, actually, what you start seeing, and that's my personal view, is that it's becoming more difficult to publish with survey data if that's the only data that you have. It's not impossible. I'm just saying I think it's becoming a bit more difficult nowadays. One way to deal with this is that actually is now trying to get using secondary data sets that are available, that have been validated. And that have information about export operations. So I think that would be, maybe if I would be a researcher, I would start thinking about using this type of data where there's not a question about, you know, the validity and the reliability of your data, and that actually other researchers can access it. So lately I have been using more these type of data. But it's a difficult issue. I mean, we always assume that the authors are, you know, that they are honest. So I think that's all we should always assume anyway. If someone submits us to, if we putting from an editorial point of view, you know, being the editor or associate editor. But it's difficult to indeed to make sure that everything is transparent and you know, and correct when they send us a paper.
Excellent, thank you. Sana, would you like to add any of your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I would also like to highlight the role of publishers here, because it would be helpful for authors if the journals would share common rules. And also if you have these rules so that they are not applied kind of backward. So if I this year collected the data in certain way, and I did not ask my respondents if they are happy if I download my data on data repository outside EU, and next year JIBS or Journal of International Marketing decides that, okay, you need to download or upload your data here, and suddenly I have valuable data that I can't use anymore. So I've come across with these issues in consumer research related topics. So I think that is also a little bit problematic. So these GDPR issues and others. So how to make sure that the data that I collect now is still valid in 2 years when I submit my paper. So that's some concerns that I have related to this topic.
Excellent. Brian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I really liked how you used the word validity or valid, because that means that we should be trying to do research that reflects what's happening in real life, right? And sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes it seems like, or you see in research methods, portions of papers that outliers or extreme outliers were done away with in the sample, such that we had almost, I don't want to say exactly, but you're led to believe you had a pretty good distribution, right? So the implication is that you can have some pretty good findings, right? And the point is that we can have our model actually tell us or find exactly what we propose, so that all of our hypotheses are found to be correct. And what if that doesn't actually happen in real life? Or maybe it's a little bit more interesting that maybe not all of the hypotheses are found, you know, to be correct. So maybe that's a personal quandary that I have, but to me that smacks of an invalid issue, because you have this situation of what reality is and what we're trying to test, and it's yeah, it really makes me question validity sometimes.
It kind of reminds me of the Don Lehman paper in the special issue of JM for Y2K and consumer research, where he notes that it might be better if we just allowed scholars to say what they thought they were studying at the beginning than what they found and what we've learned from what they found or didn't find.
Well, and I understand the reason why is because the pressure to publish is so intense. I understand that, but still, you know, I'm sorry.
No, that's a great point, and John's made some great points in the chat as well. So make sure you're following the chat. Ahmet, you've been involved in IB and exporting. Is there anything you'd like to add for our participants pertaining to your thoughts on the future of exporting research and the need for it?
Well, I mean, I think on the exporting side, there's a lot of potential, partly because I think we should be able to bring the marketing strategy knowledge to the international business, and exporting research has done a phenomenal job of making that link and introducing the multi-level issues that Sana mentioned about. The fact that managers are embedded in organizations and those organizations are embedded in other contexts as really a lot of potential in that area. So, I mean, that's one of the things I would have liked to mention. But again, going back to the topic that I briefly talked about, in my opinion, I think we need to be really careful in terms of, it's not just a positioning issue. I mean, that's why I somewhat disagree with Brian. Yeah, we should be good marketers, but marketing faculty should also read and be familiar with the IB research when they are making strong claims about the potential contributions of their papers. And that's not what I always see in JMR and JM. And that's a little disappointing for me because yeah, I need to be a marketing scholar and I should be really open-minded about those issues. But if I published a meta-analysis about multinationality or internationalization of emerging markets, and when I see a statement about, well, there's really little research on the internationalization of emerging markets or firms from emerging markets in the marketing literature, I get disappointed. So that's not really a context issue or a positioning issue, but I strongly urge marketing scholars to become much more knowledgeable about IB topics and how those IB topics are actually covered in the home discipline, IB.
Excellent. Brian, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you. Ahmet and I sometimes have really cool conversations, so I'm glad that he disagreed. I'll respectfully disagree with him that it is a positioning issue. And just to clarify, I meant that when I was talking about it being a positioning issue, I meant that the responsibility was on international marketers' side in order to communicate what exporting actually should be or would be in their research. So if it means using emotional intelligence or some of the other topics that I talked about, or aligning exporting with some of the topics in those other journals to be more appealing, that's what I'm talking about. We can't help the ignorance of others who are outside of the domain. Right, we can't control that. So for me, the way I was saying positioning was just internally within the international marketing field. That's kind of what I meant, just to clarify.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we are coming up against our ending. What I would like to do is just make one comment and thank everyone. So I would say that, my conversations with a lot of the scholars in our field, we would love to see more exporting research submitted to a broad range of marketing and IM journals. I think that's also very well represented by the comments by John and Matt and our panelists. I know that my conversations with Saeed and with Tamer, they'd love to see more exporting research. And it is our community, to Matt's point about the community of scholars, it is our community which supports those scholars as they're researching in the field of exporting to help build the paper to be stronger, rather than going towards our usual dark side of saying reject a paper, but thinking about how we can help the paper find a path forward towards publication. I want to greatly thank Carlos, Sana, and Brian for presenting and sharing their thoughts with us today, as well as all of our participants. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for taking the time out of your Friday, especially at this time of the academic semester for many of you, to come and to listen to the thoughts of our speakers. It's with great pleasure that I've had the opportunity to work with Ahmet and his team at Michigan State, and then Katie Lane and Monica Espinoza here at Texas A&M University. So I'm grateful, thankful for everyone who has participated in this and helped facilitate an excellent discussion. Ahmet, I'll turn it over to you for final comments.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, David, for for collaborating on this interesting series, Research Spotlights, and certainly kudos goes to your team at Texas A&M Cyber, and for making the arrangements and promoting the event as well. I would like to thank our participants, our panelists. This was a great discussion, and I think exporting is an amazing research topic that we should keep building on. And we have heard a lot of interesting suggestions, recommendations from our panelists today. And we're looking forward to seeing you again in one of our events in the future. I think we're done for the semester unless David and I convince each other to launch one more just before the, the conferences and so on, but I'm not really sure. We'll talk about that, but definitely next fall, we'll come back with some other research spotlights events and cover interesting topics just like the exporting research. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. It's been fun. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.